Hi, it's Warren Huart here. Hope you're doing marvelously well. I'm here again with our apprentice, Natalie, from the Recording Connection.
That's me.
What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about compressors, but we're going to do software compressors. We did the acoustic guitar one a couple of weeks ago, so we saw some hardware stuff. And as you know, I like to use 160s, 1176s. I use them in series. We had some fun with it. What I want to do here is do some I wouldn't call it high level, but we'll do some side chaining stuff. We'll see how compressors can be more than just the obvious thing that you use to control the dynamic range. Honestly, I like compressors as a quick, lazy way to do some great mixing. You know, like to control instruments and let them breathe around each other by side chaining them. So we'll have some fun with that, and we'll use the compressor in a couple of straightforward ways as well.
Fun.
Okay, so we have the session open here. What's interesting is there's not a huge amount of compression going on this by many standards. This song breathes quite a lot. Like if I just drop it in on the middle of the verse.
It doesn't seem as fun now. A little sadder, a little lonely. So this is getting older.
So when selecting when to use compression, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go for really overly dynamic instruments. And one of those is basically the acoustic. If you see here, you've got the intro acoustic, just pretty hot, quite a high level. And then the verse is almost non-existent in comparison. So I have to, now obviously I can do volume automation to control that, but that's where compression really comes in. It's kind of a case of controlling the dynamic range. So if I just highlight this for a second. I mean, you hear the compression, you hear that I don't really care. I kind of like it sometimes because when I feel like it's got that little choking effect, to me that makes it sound exciting. Now, if it was a really open acoustic guitar song, I would hate hearing that on the acoustics. But it drops in the track. We play that intro. First of all, it's not super audible. It's not cutting across it, but it adds to the excitement. So how are we compressing it? Well, I'm cheating because I'm really doing subtle amounts of compression. Compression is definitely a very, what's the best way of describing it? Compression is something that's very misunderstood, and there's millions of different things you can do. See, what I have here is I'm actually using an analog channel. And if you go to this setting here, there's gain reduction. Now, this is an old plugin. It's Mac DSP. Have been making this for, I don't know, since the late 90s. And it does one of two things. It is a tape simulation, plus it gives you gain reduction through here. So I'm getting less than a dB's worth of gain reduction. However, it's being bussed to, and this is where it's really happening. It's being bussed to a Waves Crystal Algae CLA 76. So this is what we're mainly hearing here. And this is a classic compressor. The reason why I mentioned the analog channel is because it's a tape simulation, and tape, when we used to always just record on tape, gave us natural compression because you could hit it really hard and the transients would roll off beautifully and it would do what a compressor does. It was part of, that's an oversimplification, it was part of the process of compression. So look, let's see what's happening here. Now you're going to see a lot more. Now, the release is set in the middle, so it's actually set quite slowly. So if I go over here and turn it to the right, watch the needle. See, it's coming back much quicker. And if you hear it, it doesn't sound quite so choked. We'll take the compressor off. Put it on. Definitely compressing, but it's a little bit more invisible now. Now, if I slow down the release time, see what it's doing? You can hear what it's doing. Now it's sort of, it doesn't have that attack, that coming in and out. Go to the fastest release time, and you'll see a lot more dynamics in that. Usually, to be honest, when I'm using 1176s, I just wind that to the full right-hand side. There's very rarely I use a slower release time. but I think in this instance, it choked it in a way that was kind of musical. So it's not very often I do that. I think I specifically did it because I just wanted to kind of like have it kind of choking out, add some energy to it, rather than be quite so hi-fi. But if I put it back in the middle there, and the way you do that in Pro Tools is to hit Option, and it will return to, I could do Option there. No, it's not it. Yeah, it will just go back to a standard setting. So let's go to our fastest release time again. So I'm going to work on our attack here. So I'll go to the full left, full right, that's the full right. With that super fast release time, there's not a huge amount of sonic difference. What I did now is I went to a very, very aggressive ratio. Now the way, this is one of the most misunderstood conversations, that basically the difference between, say, 4:1 down here, 8:1, 12:1, and 20:1 is this. So basically it needs to be 4 dB over the threshold before it lets 1 dB through. So basically on 4:1 where we had it, it will let a dB go over the threshold, but only once it's 4 dB louder. If you go to 20, that's pretty hardcore limiting. It needs to be 20 dB above that threshold before it lets 1 dB through. And this is cool. I mean, we talked a couple of weeks ago about hardware compressors. Right. So this is a simulation of a hardware compressor, obviously a classic 1176. It is what is known as a fixed threshold compressor. So what happens, there's a point where it's fixed, and as you turn up the gain, when it gets to a point that the signal goes above the threshold, that's when the compressor starts working. So if you want more compression, you basically do this. Because now what I'm doing is I'm turning the signal above the threshold. We can, with the fixed threshold, it's barely doing anything there. So we're like halfway between 38 and 48 there. Bring it up. It's an important thing to understand. I like fixed threshold 1176s. They make my life really easy. This setting here on attack and release is pretty standard. You start bringing it back in here and you're just starting to grab the signal somewhat aggressively. Over here, as you can see, the attack time, it's not fast enough to get all of the transients. There are many faster plug-in compressors these days than classic simulations. I think a lot of us use the classic simulations because we're used to the sound and we're used to the flexibility of the way they work. But quite frankly, we can go and we can use other plugins. If I just for a second bypass that and come in here, let's try something that's not modeled on anything. I'm going to open up the RComp, the Renaissance compressor. This one, just going to highlight a little tighter around this. So here's my threshold here. So I'll bring it over, so now my ratio. The great thing about this is the release time is super fast. Attack is super fast. I put it all the way over here. It's really super slow. It's barely doing it until I start turning my threshold up. So it's a real balancing act sonically. And look, even understanding the way a compressor works is great. It really helps to understand the difference between like how fast it grabs and how fast it releases. Sure, that's fantastic. It's really important to understand ratio, that When you're up to here, 50 to 1, that's limiting. I put the attack time fast, and the release time fast. Super, super aggressive. But how does it sound?
Sad.
Yeah, it's
I
like
don't like it.
a little too squashed. So yeah, it sounds dead. So it's nice to let a little bit of attack go through and make it more musical. I think one of the things about compression, especially on acoustic guitars when it's in a dense mix, is it's okay to let it dance out a little bit and let the attack come through somewhat. Like this. So I'm cranking the acoustics here. See, the release time isn't fast enough to keep that too percussive, so I'm going to play it a little bit. See, with that attack there, I hear it pumping a little bit, but it's kind of musical and aggressive. So the great thing is, even if you don't like understand, you know, it's kind of a catch-22. Even if you don't understand exactly how the attack and release relate to each other, at first, play with it and you'll start understanding why it's nice to have faster release times. Because if I grab the front of this signal here and I've got a really slow release time, like I go all over here, this is what you're going to see. Look at the dynamic range and listen to how it's... Go here. Now it just feels like it's turned down. Go to the full left, the fastest release. I hear the attacks coming back on each hit. So that's a good way. I always find like anything, when you're trying to learn compression and stuff like that, super percussive instruments are the way to go, because you're going to hear like attack and release times where it's letting that percussion come through. Like we could go up to, let's go up to some overheads. This is kind of fun. We go to overheads and we choose the same compressor, for instance. Okay. Yeah. So there you go, nothing happening in a moment. Let's have some fun with it. Ratio up a little bit. Even just that standard setting, pretty awesome. Yeah, I love the default setting. I talk about this all the time with the Renaissance compressor. The default setting is really cool. If I go to super fast. Slowest release time. There's something about that default in the middle. So now it's got that little spanky, almost SSL. It's not an SSL at all. For those that have SSLs will tell me it doesn't sound like an SSL, but it's got a little bit of that spankiness to it. So what I like about it is it sort of makes that overhead now. I've had situations where I've been mixing and I haven't had any room mics whatsoever. So I've duplicated the overheads and turned them into like room mics. Like done that, created some enhanced transients and then put a reverb after it. You know, what we could do next, for instance, is we could come along and go to our dynamics and just for schniggles get a DeEsser, which is just a multi-band compressor. So what you're doing is you're coming along and you're going, that harshness. Look how it's making the cymbals. Take it off. Just darkening the cymbals up. It's also darkening the snare up a little bit too much, but you hear what it's doing with the cymbals? Yeah. It is unfortunately affecting the snare a little bit too much, but that's fine. What we could do then is just for schniggles, is we could go along and put a reverb on it. You know, and we're starting to create a room mic. Now that's not the world's greatest room mic by any means. We could get a lot more creative. But you know, when you're in situations like that where you want to try and exaggerate some of the transients, that's where compression is. Compression isn't always just for controlling transients and stuff like that. You know, it's also sonics. I mean, if I go to the CLA 1176, I'm going to get a very different sound. It's kind of cool, actually. If I bring the output down and do this. There's something about that 1176 that's just really awesome. I'm slamming the schnizzle out of it, but you know, it's again, so it's not just for controlling dynamic range. Yes, it does control the dynamic range, but you use it for shaping things, and each compressor has its own sound, especially the simulations. Say it again?
Quite artistic, actually. More
Yeah.
than you'd think.
I think you know, if I take, for instance, if we turn this, I agree, if we take this stuff we put on off for a second. We take that off. Let's go. I'm going to do something. We're going to grab a favorite compressor of mine, which would be a Compressor Bank, which has been using for years. Play with this. So there you go. If I reverse that order, so obviously there's a 2.5 second release, so nothing's ever going to happen. I go the fastest release. I love how that's taking overheads. They're really aggressively hitting the transients. Just let it a little bit through, and it starts making my overheads sound like room mics, because everything that's super quiet underneath is coming through really dramatically with the compression. That's a zero compression, 1-to-1. Love that. So now my overheads are immediately starting to become room mics. That's what they were before. I mean, that wouldn't be the world's greatest overhead sound, but I would blend that for a bit of energy. I've done stuff when I first moved over here. I'd mix people's stuff, and they would send me drums that were recorded, and they probably were just learning how to record drums, and there was so much bleed. Like the overhead mics were offset to one side. Sometimes they were usable, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes I would use like a floor tom mic or a rack tom mic, believe it or not, and use those as cymbal mics because they'd be so far away from the tom, you'd be picking up the cymbals.
You should learn how to do that, right?
Yeah, it's almost like you learn all these wrong things, you know. Now, here's another thing you can do with it. Let's have some fun with this. So we're listening to this, and there's a lot of snare in it, for instance. Let's just say we don't want as much snare, and we want more overheads. Here's a fun thing you can do. So let's go along and go to our snare. Let's go to a snare here. Here, I'm going to send from bus 1. So I'm sending from bus 1, and I'm going to make that pre-fade. And then I'm going to key input bus 1. Which for some reason is all the way down there, but whatever. So what does that do? I hit key listen. Now look what's happening. It's great. So all the cymbals, it's too much, but all the cymbals, we don't have to get, it's a little too aggressive, obviously. But now it's just compressing where the snare hits. It's really nice. Try and even it out a little bit so the levels. We can go to auto. Oh, it's completely over the top.
Yeah.
But it demonstrates what it's doing, is it's only compressing when the snare hits. So that kind of trick, sidechain compression, is really useful. It's really useful when you are doing things like guitar solos at the end of songs, or vocals at the end of songs, like ad-libs, and you want them to stick out over. Like here, let's have a look. We've got, what do we have going on here? Let's just play the end of the song. That's pretty loud, so it's not too much of an issue, but let's have a quick listen to all of the synth stuff that we've got going on the end. Like there's a lot of pads here. Let's have a listen. So there's a lot of pad stuff going on there. There is a vocal just doing a ad-lib ooh-oohs. Here it is. It's a manufactured harmony. You'd never have guessed, would you? All right, so let's try something. So, you know, you can hear those. There's loads of them here. There's all the manufactured ones, and then there's the live one up here. Another way to do some sidechain compression would be this. So on the end of the song, press play. We have Chase doing that ooh-ee-ooh-ee part, like the way I said that. So, but what happens if we wanted to add some more energy to the track and maybe we push the synths up? So let's do this. We're going to turn the synths up. I don't know, 2.3 dB. Okay, so let's have a listen. Not even really that loud. Let's go up another dB for the, oh, look at that, 2.5 dB.
Whoa.
Whoa. Cool. So that's a little nutty, but so what it's doing is it's affecting the ooh-ee-ooh part there. Like that technical term, ooh-ee-ooh. And we're going to get the dynamics. So let's pick our friend, the RCompressor again. And we're going to take that section. I'll take it around here. And we're going to create, I don't know, let's use bus 30. Bus 30. I can say that because I'm Port Irish. Okay, so I'm going to go to bus 30. And I am going to send to there. I hit option on there and that sends it to 0. So it defaults it to there. So when that vocal comes in, that's really dramatic. I mean, that's completely exaggerated, totally dramatic and not what you would do, but it's like a poor man's way of automating. Because what I've done there is like when it goes, ooh, 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 it's just the keyboard's just sucked down because it's being controlled from the vocal. Now, obviously, we can get a little less insane with it, make it a little bit more subtle. Nice there, 2 to 3 dB. It's interesting. I mean, I hear it kind of pumping around the vocal, but it's really kind of cool. Now, obviously, in dance music, this is used all the time. So everybody who's watching this that does EDM is looking at me like, you're an idiot, Warren. We've been doing this for years. But we've been doing it in rock and roll for years. This is how traditionally you would mix like screaming guitar solos at the end of a song. I've done it on so many heavy rock songs where there's a lead vocalist going, wah, you know, ad-libbing, and there's a lead guitar player at the same time. And you'll just take the lead vocal and just sidechain over the, sidechain compress the lead guitar. So the lead guitar player is shredding away, and every time there's an ad-lib by the singer, it would just duck the lead guitar by about 2 dB or 1.5 dB and just create the room. You can also multiband compress and compress out frequencies when your mix is so dense. On like super like hardcore heavy rock, sometimes you just want to compress like certain instruments, frequencies of instruments to allow other things to come through. Because a lot of the time mixing heavy rock is like blocks of sound, like a massive guitar sound, a massive drum sound. And you'll go in and you'll pull out like spikes of frequencies, like little tiny, areas just to slot things in. But you'll get an area where maybe you have 2 or 3 guitar parts playing and you want to create some room. So sidechain compression, sidechain multiband compression is really fun. So once again, totally exaggerated, but you'll get the idea. Great. Now, obviously, you'd say, well, the thing is, Warren, you've got it on the whole time. So obviously, here I am. I'm in the bypass mode. It's just added that to the automation, so I can go along and I can put it into bypass here. So it's highlighted on bypass, and here it comes. That's really exaggerated. And it's quite silly, you hear the keyboards ducking down 3 dB and coming back up. But use more subtly and playing with the release time, just so it maybe comes up a little slower, so it's not quite so, I like this. Just have some fun with it. But like I was saying earlier, with EDM guys, they've been taking kick drums, like 4-on-the-floor kicks, and making their keys go, nyep, 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 because that kick is ducking that. And there's also other things that I love doing, and we'll do it here. Let's have some fun with it.
Well,
yes.
I want to know why go through all of this sidechain compression schnizzle, if you will, rather than just like raising up the parts of the vocals. Why lower the keyboard? Because
it takes about 2 nanoseconds to do this, and it's. I also think that it's drawing it in so much more beautifully. But you can do both. It depends on the effect. And again, it's just really exaggerated. I never would do it this exaggerated in real life. Not unless I wanted to hear it, obviously pumping up.
Yeah.
But when you're taking instruments in similar frequencies and you just do this, it's almost like the guitar player maybe was like playing a solo and then just kind of volume riding back and then coming back in around the guitar player. Around the singer, sorry, and that's so much easier to do with a compressor, just gently lifting and ducking. It's beautiful, and it saves a lot of like drawing it in manually or running. Even running with a fader. That makes more sense
to me with like the guitar thing, because with like a keyboard that's synthesized, and you wouldn't really have the
absolutely,
pressure.
Definitely.
It's a bit more artificial.
Here's another fun thing, seeing as we're on sidechain compression, which we hadn't initially thought of, but it's kind of cool. Here's another fun one. So here's a bass guitar, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull the bass up for a second, all the way up to here. And you know what? Let's go to the master of the bass. So I'm going to bring the master up just visually so we can see this, and I'm going to bring it up underneath a kick drum. So let me just get in here for a second. So I'm going to take the kick and the bass, they're solo together. Let's just have a listen. That sounds good. Says the man who played the bass. Sounds good. Just joking, but now you're going to get a spike of a lot of bottom end happening with the kick. Said the man there that basically didn't play in time with the kick drum. Shh. So there's a couple of reasons why you might do this. What I'm about to do. So firstly, I'll just take a kick drum, and I'll take a bus again, and I'll send the bus to the compressor. Now, why would I do this? I'm going to compress the bass. Well, there's a couple of things that are nice. What they would do in the disco days where they couldn't sit there. Well, actually, that's not true. In disco and stuff, I have friends that made records, like Don Smith told me when he was making records in the late 70s, and Dave Jordan told me they would measure every kick drum, believe it or not. So they'd measure the distance between a kick and the next kick, and then they would put leader tape in to make sure every...
on the
tape
with rulers.
Yep. So they would say, oh, the average tempo is going to be, I don't know, whatever,
Wow.
3 feet or whatever it is. And then they would cut and they'd make sure that every kick and snare was the equal distance apart. So, and quite often they would have to lay back the kick. So it just kind of had that, you know, down, down, that kind of groove that they wanted. So they'd sit there and move everything back so it was the same distance away. Seriously, measure every kick, every snare. They'd sit there on a tape machine, zip, 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 find the transient and then mark it with a China graph pencil. What do you call that in America? The white pencils?
Chalk.
We call them China graphs, but those, would the Americans please tell me what that's called? They're probably going to say China graph, but those wax pencil. Like a wax pencil, isn't it? Okay. So they'd mark it. They'd mark it on the tape, and then they would cut it because they'd find the transient, zip, 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 just where it happened, and then mark all those out. And then another trick they used to do is they would do what we're about to do here. Is they would take the kick drum, and they would take the transient, like the hits. Anyway, that kick drum would then trigger a compressor, a sidechain compressor, on the bass. So what happens is you hear the initial tack of a kick. So you don't get that double kind of, it's just the man picking up the bass quickly. You don't get this, you just hear, So you don't hear that initial attack of the pick, you know, the string being picked. And so all the attack came from the kick drum. So it can be very, very subtle, but it also, and people hate this word, glue it together because it basically made it so, basically, with the bass, it basically made it so that kick and bass were sort of became almost one thing. So I got my bass master down here. I've got my kick playing here. Let's have a listen. It's awesome. You hear what it's doing? Take it off. I love it when those hits hit together.
Satisfying.
It's really good because it just ducks the first part of the bass because it's compressing with the kick. So it's not triggering the transit, not being triggered by the transient of the bass by me playing on top or behind the groove or whatever. It's just sucking that down so that kick has a place to live. It's also really, really good as a mix tool because if you've got a lot of build-up at bottom end, like you've got a bass guitar, a synth bass, dance kick going boom, 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 you can blow up the whole bottom end of your mix because you've got this huge bottom end kick, an 808 kick. You've got a huge synth, you know, bass going wah, wah, wah. And if you can sidechain it from the kick, you stop that build-up of the crossover of the synth bass, the live bass, and the kick drum all hitting at the same time, and like 20 to 60 hertz just blowing the bottom end out of your speakers. So it's a really, really nice trick. Sidechain compression. Actually, for me, I use a lot more. You know, I use it on the overheads all the time. That trick I did earlier with the overheads, I use that a lot, very subtly. But I like what it does to the snare because it gives it kind of this pat, 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 pat sound, and it makes my snare sound good in my mix. So it's not even so much that I'm removing the snare a little bit out of the overheads, which of course it does. I just like what it does to my snare drum. It gives me this extra kind of snappy transient sound. So there's a little bit more to compression than just controlling the dynamic range. You've got all these fun things you can do with them.
Is there any other tool that would also do that for you?
Yeah, but automation, but it takes a lot longer.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, you can automate anything. And of course, you should, you know, when you're trying to do really fun, crazy things like huge volume rides and stuff like that. Yeah. But the thing about using sidechain compression is it's a quick and easy way to get across a whole track, get every bass and kick hit, to get the vocal over the electric guitar solo, whatever it is, and it does it beautifully and just ducks nicely. Because that's what we used to call it. It was ducking. If you ever listen to like radio, you know, you're not old enough, but like in the 60s and the 70s radio stations, and you can imagine if you ever see old movies, the music would be like, jan, 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 oh, You know what I mean? You hear that music coming in super loud. That's what they call ducking. So every time the guy or girl, the DJ, would speak on the mic, the music, using a sidechain compressor, would duck the appropriate amount of dB. So if he was talking, 3 dB, 6 dB would suck down, and his vocal would be clearly audible. And as soon as he stopped talking, it would come up super loud. And for those...
Even back then?
Even back then. When I was a kid in the 80s, going on vacations like Spain and Portugal, I don't know if anybody is English and used to go to Spain and Portugal, they would... it still was like that. You felt like you were walking back into the sort of the 60s or something. And you'd hear like these, sorry to the Spanish speakers. Oh, wait there. Do you speak Spanish?
Hablo español.
Hablo español. But it was funny. You'd be like sitting on the beach with the local radio station. They'd be like, the music would just like suck down so dramatically. I remember it being like a thing that all the kids would all talk about. Like, what was that? And then, I was like 13 and you talk to the musical people and they're like, oh, it's called ducking. It's ducking. Anyway, so what we're doing is sidechain compressing here is basically what they did in radio for years, ducking. And compression really became the most useful tool because of radio stations. Because of things like this. Radio stations, and of course, because they had a limited bandwidth they could have, so they wanted to print really super loud signals. They still do. If you turn on FM radio, you can print your dynamic mix, but by the time you hear it on radio, it's even more compressed.
Yeah.
So, which, I was talking to Shelley Yakus about it, and Shelley was like, he liked, living on the East Coast, he used to like coming to LA in the 60s and listening to the way the radio sounded. Because they would use different compressors that did different things. And because a lot of these radio station compressors were quite simplistic. They didn't have a massive amount they had like maybe 3 selections of release or attack times. So if one company happened to be used one kind of compressor and was smashing it in a certain way, it would be completely different to the East Coast. So he said he would come to the West Coast and turn on the radio, and he said he'd be like listening to the songs that he had worked on, and they would sound different to him than when he was on the East Coast, listening to the East Coast radio stations. It would be like, oh wow, because the compressor would be pumping in a different way. Yeah. So fun stuff.
Yeah.
So, compression is not just controlling dynamic range. Obviously, it's very important on the way in, like we were talking about recording guitar a couple of weeks ago, because we want to control the dynamic range somewhat, so that we're not like going cling-a-ding-a-ding, slang. We want to put a nice controlled signal in there. These days, I think with digital recording, people are less inclined to compress anymore. They still compress, but they're not as aggressive as they used to be on tape. And I also think the mentality from when I started on tape was things sounded more like the record when you pulled them up on faders. People tended to print very much like they wanted to hear it, which I still think is the way to go, because it makes your production process faster, because you commit and then you make another decision. So there was definitely more compression in records. Like if you pull up old files, stems you can get online of old recordings, there's some just like super compressed signals, both from compressors and tape compression, causing this big like blobs of, like vocal, just like, whoa. Or the bass guitar is just like, boom. And that, that was the sound. They'd pull it up on the console and then they would just mix it by using faders, not by applying additional compression or additional EQ, which we're so used to doing now.
Right. So, when do you not use a compressor?
Quite often. I mean, as you can see here, I'm not doing that much on the drums. And that might...
But you're still doing something.
I'm doing some things. I'm doing little bits of like... It really depends. The thing with the drum performance here is I actually, using the console over there, I ran it really hot through the console. So a lot of these sounds here are right on the verge. You see they're almost like so identical. It's because they hit the console the same consistently. So I actually use the consoles. That's the bottom snare, and there's quite a lot of print through on the kick. So for instance, here's some fun while we're on that subject. Let's go back and just grab our same old, the Renaissance compressor is getting a lot of love today. So what do we use for the kick? We're going to use the same bus one, make sure it's on pre-fade. And let's have a listen to this. Look what it's doing. It's sidechaining the kick out of the snare. Listen to it. But what I like about it, again, that default setting that Waves has is really good. I'm going to squash it quite heavily, and it kind of gives me a nice pat, pat, pat on my kick. Take it off. So sometimes, when do you gate and when do you sidechain compress? Because I could have used a gate to try and capture all of that, but just using the kick alone, it made my life so much easier. Now, the only time you're going to come unstuck is when you're playing a 4-on-the-4 groove. Either the whole time where it's going, you know, kick, snare, you know what I mean? And you're going kick, snare, kick, snare. What would happen is that kick would compress the snare out of the snare drum. So you have to be careful of that. Or at one bar, you know, he goes, you know, he does that kick snare kind of 4 on the floor. So what I did is, because I printed that super fat through the console, what I mean by that is, like, I had the mic pre, as you can tell, there's not a lot of dynamics in it because I hit the mic pre super, super hard. Even somewhat on the snare top. We can have a listen on the snare top. Take it off. So I kind of like what it does, because not only is it compressing, you know, sidechain compressing the kick out of the snare, it's also making the kick kind of sound cool in the snare. You know, so, you know, you might find that if I'm using compression on drums, I'm doing that kind of stuff with it. So if I take that off, yeah, it kind of gives a little tiny spankiness to it, that kind of pop, pop, which I like. So, you know, there's a lot of fun things you can do with compressors that aren't just doing the usual dynamic range reduction, you know, of the main signal itself. Sidechain compression is really fun. So I hope you had a marvelous time.
I did have a marvelous time. I hope you had a marvelous time.
I find that what tends to happen is, like, I want to start off on, like, the basics of the compressor and stuff like that, but I feel like there's so much more fun things you can do with compression. You know, I think the best way to learn a compressor, honestly, and I get asked all the time, I should probably have started with this, to be honest. The best way to learn a compressor is to load a stereo drum loop in. That's why I like using the overheads, because it's the closest thing we have. Now, the thing about using, like, a stereo drum loop, maybe of a pair of mics in a room on a drum kit, if they were close with the right kind of attack and release, you can make them feel really, really roomy. And with the opposite kind of just as good sounding attack and release, you can make it sound really, really attacky. So they get really small. You can make like a tack, 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 tack. It can also be seriously, because you're bringing up all the ambience in the background. So it's really just balancing that attack and release time and getting it absolutely perfect. Super fast, you know, letting snappy attack through, and really, really quick release times will give you that percussiveness. Just holding on a little bit more to the release time in just the right way can start bringing in some of the ambience. So it's just balancing those attack and release times. And I honestly think that a live drum loop will teach you so much more than anything else. You know, understanding ADSR is great. That's attack, decay, sustain, and release. So it's the attack of the signal, the decay, and then, which is like where it drops off, and then the sustain, where it pretty much stays at the same volume-ish, and then the release time. Understanding attack, decay, sustain, and release is kind of cool. There are some compressors that have all of those functions. So there's some really flashy compressors, especially hardware ones, that can control all of that. However, you're talking about, unless it's a programmed element, it's hard to get the exact attack, decay, sustain, and release to work on every single thing. Because a vocal melody might be, I don't know why you can't bear. So, you know, if I sit there and try to like balance that, I might get the attack time and I might get a release time to kind of work on it. But when you have more control than the length of a syllable, etc. Anyway, my point is like sometimes for the dumb guy like me, because I'm just a guitar player after all, I like the simple compressors. That's why I like 1176s. That's why I like 160s and the simulations as well, is because they're really, really dumb. And I think
everyone who likes 1176 is dumb.
Well, I'm dumb.
Oh.
I like 11.6s. You guys might be all smart, but I personally like to move quickly and be creative and stuff. I do find that, as we've seen here, that the Renaissance compressor, and you can move between opto and you can get different kinds of sounds as well, is a good standard way to learn compression because it's really, really simple and dumb. If you have it, try it out. You don't have to. Some of the stock plugins, like the DigiDesign stock one, showing my age, the Avid stock one, and I know in Reaper, whatever your DAW is, you'll have compressor plugins that you can play with and try. But have fun with the sidechain compression because it will be a new element to add to your mixing. Any other questions about compression?
Many, but I can't think of them now.
That's all right. All right, have a marvelous time recording and mixing. Of course, leave loads of questions and comments below. Thank you, Natalie from Recording Connection.
You're welcome, Warren from Spitfire Studios.
Spitfire
and
Studios.
Produce Like a Pro and all the other things.
All right.
You do a lot.
I do.
Yeah.
Have a marvelous, and I'm blessed, have a marvelous time recording and mixing, and I'll speak to you again soon.